Hi, this is Gabe at fluentforever.com. At this point, we've gone through all the sounds of Brazilian Portuguese. If you're using one of my pronunciation trainers, it's going to take you through all of these sounds, train your ears to hear them more accurately, and teach you the spellings that produce them. Then it'll push all that data into your long-term memory. And if you're not, that's fine too. I made these videos to give you a passing familiarity with all the sounds of Portuguese, so that when you study them in depth, they're going to feel more familiar. That'll make them easier to learn. In either case, I want to cover a handful of important Portuguese spelling rules before we finish, because they're the rules that require just a touch of explanation rather than straight memorization. We'll start by discussing how D and T work, then we'll talk about when to produce voiced S and Z, we'll chat about the letter R, and then we'll talk about word stress. So let's get started with D and T. These consonants almost always produce the sounds you'd expect.
D and T, as in dedo and tudo.
The exception is when these consonants show up before the letter I, or before an unstressed E at the end of a word.
In these two cases, D and T make a J and Ch sound, respectively. So you have words like dia and chigre,
where those consonants are showing up before the letter I.
And cidade and tomate,
where they're showing up before an unstressed letter E at the end of a word. And just as a side note, you'll notice that the final unstressed letter E is pronounced E.
That's actually another spelling rule. Unstressed E at the end of the word sounds like E, not E or E. So it's cidade and tomate, not cidade and tomate.
So that's all for D and T. Our next topic has to do with the letters S and Z. These two letters are tricky because both of them are sometimes pronounced S, that is to say unvoiced, and sometimes pronounced Z, so they're voiced. Let's start with the letter S. S sounds just the way you'd expect it to, in all of the following situations.
In the beginning of a word, like in sino, at the end of a word, like in Hans, in the middle of a word, followed by another consonant, like in esqui, or whenever you see two S's in a row, like in osu.
The one case in which you're going to switch over to a voiced Z sound is when you see a lone S in between two vowels.
That gives you words like asa and rosa.
Switching over to Z. Z is generally going to give you a voiced Z sound, that sound you'd expect, whenever it shows up in the beginning of a word.
Like in zebra, or in the middle of the word, like in cinza.
But at the end of a word, if you see a Z, you're going to make an unvoiced S sound.
That gives you words like nariz and raiz.
While we're talking about S and Z, I'll throw in a quick note about the letter X. X is a bit of an unpredictable pain in Portuguese. There is one rule that it does seem to follow, which is that when it shows up in between two vowels in the beginning of a word, it sounds like a Z.
Giving words like exibir and exame.
But aside from that, you just need to memorize X words individually.
Since it can sound like sh as in xilofone, s as in máximo, and x as in taxi.
The main saving grace of X, honestly, is that it's one of the least used letters in the language. Anyway, moving on. Our next stop is the letter R. Back in the first video, we briefly mentioned some rules regarding R, and I just wanted to expand a bit on those.
So starting with that R tap, that R sound.
That sound generally shows up in a couple of places. When the letter R is preceded by a consonant and followed by a vowel,
as in trigo,
or whenever a single R shows up in between two vowels,
as in morango or caro.
Any other times you see an R in a word, it will be pronounced as an H. So that means you'll hear that H sound at the beginnings of words,
as in rato,
at the ends of words or syllables,
as in mar.
And next, and here's where it starts getting interesting, in the middle of words when that R is doubled up,
as in carro and burro.
And in an exception to that consonant rule we talked about earlier, whenever an R shows up after an L, an S, or an N, it will be pronounced as an H.
This gives you words like melro, Israel, and honra.
And so that's how R works. One quick pronunciation note before we move on. That H pronunciation, that's the standard you'll hear on official news broadcasts. But among native speakers, you'll hear a lot of variation from region to region.
You'll hear some speakers use a trilled R like in Spanish, r, or a uvular R like in French, R or chr, or even an almost American R, R.
Our pronunciation turns out to be one of the big clues as to where someone is from. And so with that, we are on to our last topic, word stress. In English, a stressed syllable can entirely change the meaning of a word. We have, for instance, incense and incense. Stress is just as important in Portuguese, but fortunately, figuring out which syllable to stress is a lot more predictable in Portuguese than it is in English. So here are the rules. Rule number 1. If a word has a vowel with a diacritic, or an accent mark, on top of it, then that syllable is going to be stressed.
So if you see an acute accent like in fácil, or a circumflex accent as in lâmpada, or even one of those nasal tilde things as in coração,
in all of those cases, you're going to stress the syllable with the diacritic. The only exception to this rule is what you do when you see a word with two diacritics.
It's rare, but it does happen in words like órgão.
In those cases, the acute accent always wins.
So it's órgão and not órgão.
Next up, we have rule number 2. Rule 2 is if a word ends in I, L, R, U, or Z. In any of those cases, the stress is going to be on the last syllable.
That gives you words like sentir, canal, trabalhar, caiu, and feliz.
The only exceptions here are when Rule 1 applies.
Meaning that you encounter a vowel diacritic, as in útil or júri.
Basically, Rule 1 is stronger than Rule 2. So if you see a diacritic, that always wins. And that leaves us with rule number 3, which covers the rest of Portuguese words. If you see a word that doesn't have a vowel diacritic, and it doesn't end in I, L, R, U, or Z, then generally, more than 70% of the time, you're going to stress the second to last syllable.
Giving you words like mesa, cadeira, and aventureiro.
And with that, we are through with word stress. Before we finish completely, I wanted to briefly mention a couple of important spots in Portuguese pronunciation where there really aren't spelling rules. These are moments where you just need to memorize word pronunciation individually. And those spots are whenever you're dealing with a stressed E or O vowel that doesn't have any diacritics on it.
For E, that means words like vela and selo.
In the spelling, all you're seeing is the letter E.
And pretty much the only way to know whether the vowel is an open E or a closed E sound is to look it up in a dictionary or find it in a recording at forvo.com.
Same idea here for the letter O.
Those are cases like roda and olho. There's nothing in the spelling telling you whether it's an open O or a closed O.
You just have to look it up. So with that out of the way, we can quickly review what we covered in this video. We started by talking about D and T,
which sound like D as in dedo and T as in tudo most of the time.
But when they show up before the letter I,
they switch over to G as in gia and chi as in chigri.
The same thing happens when they show up at the end of a word with an unstressed letter E.
You get G as in cidade and chi as in tomate. We also pointed out that that unstressed final E sounds like E rather than E or E.
After that, we discussed the spelling rules that affect S and Z. S basically sounds like an S most of the time.
In words like sino, Hans, esqui, and osso.
But when you see a single S in between two vowels, it's going to sound like a Z.
As in rosa.
As for Z, it sounds like a Z.
As in zebra.
Most of the time. But when it shows up at the ends of words, it turns into an S.
As in nariz.
In this section, we also mentioned how X is pretty unpredictable, following only one rule, where if it shows up in between two vowels at the beginning of a word, it sounds like a Z.
As in exame. But in other spots, it can be sh, s, or x, as in xilofone, máximo, and táxi.
After that, we went to the letter R. This letter sounds like an R tap in between two vowels or following most consonants.
As in morango or trigo.
But in other spots, it sounds like an H, specifically at the beginnings and ends of words.
As in rato and mar.
In the middle of words, whenever you see two R's.
As in carro.
And whenever an R shows up after an L, an S, or an N.
As in melro, Israel, and honra.
Finally, we went on to word stress, which generally followed 3 rules. Rule 1 was that you stress any vowel with a diacritic on it.
As in fácil, lâmpada, and coração.
Unless you have 2 diacritics in a word, in which case the acute accent always wins.
As in órgão.
Rule 2 was that you stressed the final syllable in any words ending with I, L, R, U, or Z.
As in sente, canal, trabalhar, caiu, and feliz.
Unless you see a diacritic, in that case, rule 1 wins. And last, we talked about rule 3, which basically says that if rules 1 and 2 don't apply, then 70% of the time you'll stress the second to last syllable.
As in mesa and cadeira.
Finally, we briefly mentioned that stressed E's and O's without any diacritics in Portuguese, these are unpredictable.
You're just going to have to look up whether the vowels are e, o, or ó.
And that is all for our review, and we are done with Portuguese. If you need a hand in memorizing all of this and training your ears to hear it, then grab a Portuguese trainer from my website linked below. You'll have all of this memorized within a couple of weeks. And with that, I will see you next time.